समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Like everyone else, suicide bombers have dreams. The dreams of jihadists we know of, full of color, heroism, and of course the occasional huri, the eternal virgins who will be the companions of the martyrs in paradise. Lashkar-e-Taiba martyrdom stories the scholar Maryam Abu Zahab records are full of mothers who see their son in paradise wearing beautiful white clothes, smiling, surrounded by trees and flowers, and drinking milk. Amir Chima, who was held for attacking the officers of a German newspaper with a knife, dreamt thus, according to his father. Fountains of light burst forth in all directions as the sacred gathering became visible. Then the Prophet himself announced that Amir Chima was arriving. Pathos, tragedy, you take your pick. Likely because of his acculturation in damp, miserable England, the person we're going to be talking about today, Richard Reed, dreamt in plodding prose. For the longest time, he wrote in one of his last emails to his family, describing his own martyrdom dream. He waited by the roadside for a ride, but when it came, the pickup truck was full. He was upset because he had to go later in a smaller car. According to Reed, the dream reflected his unhappiness at not being selected for the 9/11 plot to attack the United States. But Richard Reed turned out to have at least as much of an impact as the 9/11 bombers. This week, the United States Transportation Security Administration, which protects airports across that country, announced that travelers will no longer be required to remove their shoes while passing through security checks. That was Richard Reed's contribution to the world. In 2001, Reed was overpowered while he attempted to set fire to his shoes, which were packed with some 100 grams of the plastic explosive PETN and shoelaces made with a thread of stabilized TATP. Even today, there's debate over what might have happened if Reed had actually succeeded in setting his shoes on fire, and even if he could have. For reasons I'll come to, PETN is highly stable and not easy to ignite just by dropping it or setting it on fire. To use it generally requires a blasting cap or similar device. There's also no clarity if he had enough explosive to blow a hole in the aircraft, a Boeing 767 flown by American Airlines. And experts disagree too that would there have been enough damage to the fuselage to bring down the plane. The point is, Richard Reed's failed plot cost the American aviation industry very conservatively $5 billion a year in additional staffing and screening costs alone. Together with a string of other equally unsuccessful bombing plots, al-Qaeda succeeded in causing real harm to the global economy. And that tells us something interesting about how terrorism works. It works even when it doesn't, if we make the wrong policy choices. Trying to bomb it into submission is a bit like using a sledgehammer to swat flies. Later, Richard Reed's father, Robin Reed, described his son thus. He's not a bad lad. Loyalty to your children is a good thing, but in this case it sits somewhat uneasily with the facts. In his last letter to his mother, Leslie Hugh, Richard didn't say anything about white clothes and milk. He warned her, "You will never see me again. You had all better convert to Islam." The dreams young Richard had, I suspect, had little to do with Islam. When he was born in 1973, Robert Reed, the father, was in prison for car theft and would spend most of his son's childhood in jail. That doesn't make someone a jihadist, of course, but it does speak to the complex circumstances that lead people down particular roads and bends in their lives. Leslie and Robin had met in 1972 and married soon after. The differences in their background, he a petty criminal of Anglo-Jamaican descent, she the daughter of an accountant and magistrate from the very white Northeast, put predictable strains on their relationship. The couple separated when Richard was 4 and would later divorce. Following his father's footsteps, Richard dropped out of school at the age of 16. At 17, he went to prison for the first time, convicted of mugging a senior citizen. Like his father, Richard first discovered Islam in prison, where networks of Bangladeshi and Pakistani clerics, paid for by Saudi Arabia, had become active preaching the importance of jihad and spreading anti-American polemic. To some black prisoners, this kind of Islam offered a language of defiance against a racist order and police. Leaving prison, Richard joined the Brixton Mosque and Islamic Cultural Center, which was well known for its moderate message. Later, though, he began to attend the Islamist-leaning Finsbury Park Mosque, a hub of the British jihadist movement. According to the scholar Ziauddin Sardar, Finsbury Park attracted, I quote, younger, more disaffected Muslims, mainly from working-class backgrounds, mostly unemployed, unmarried. These guys saw themselves as totally under siege, and for them, jihad was a salvation. Together with others from the Finsbury Park circle, Richard travelled to jihadist training camps in Pakistan and Afghanistan in 1998. French intelligence officials believe he trained at the Khaldan camp alongside Zacharias Moussaoui, a terrorist who was directly associated with the September 11 attacks, 9/11. There, Reed received training from al-Qaeda's top bomb maker at the time, Midhat Mursi, also known as Abu Khabab al-Masri. Lashkar-e-Taiba operatives in London, French investigators later said, introduced all the key characters in the plot to each other and helped organize their travel and finances. No charges were brought, however. Along with Pakistani origin Briton Sajid Badat, Richard was tasked with organizing a second series of 9/11 type attacks, again targeting the American aviation industry. Osama bin Laden, Badat later testified in court, told the attackers, I quote, the American economy is like a chain. If you break one link of the chain, the whole economy will be brought down. French officials later revealed Richard had traveled the world looking for targets, his passport bearing stamps of visits to Egypt, Turkey, Pakistan, Belgium, Netherlands, France, and Israel. And the idea of the shoe bomb came to him in Tel Aviv when he was boarding an El Al flight on July 12, 2001. Richard, you see, noticed that El Al security did not check the inside of his shoes. In Amsterdam, he and Badat received identical shoe bombs, though the identity of the bomb maker has never been revealed. The plot almost derailed when Badat developed cold feet, if that's the right word for a shoe bomb plot, and dropped out. Richard, however, decided to go ahead. French officials denied him boarding on Flight 63 on his first attempt, finding him, I quote, filthy, very unkempt, emotionless, and not attempting to find out why he was being subjected to an inspection. There was no reason to hold Richard, though, and he was allowed to board the same flight the following day after a free night in a hotel. Forensics experts have since debated what exactly went wrong. First, confronted by a member of the airline crew who saw him attempting to set light to the tongue of one of his shoes, Reed was rapidly then overwhelmed by other passengers. He was then sedated with drugs kept in the aircraft medical kit. The fuse running through his shoes, some experts have speculated, may have become damp because of exposure to sweat and rain. There are other experts, though, who note that a similar attempt to detonate a PTN-based device, also using matches, failed. The attempts to target the American aviation industry, though, continued, despite the failure of Richard Reed's plot. Al-Qaeda now turned to an improbable volunteer, the mirror opposite, if you like, of Richard Reed. Umar Farooq Abdul Mutallab was one of 16 children of Al-Haji Umaru Mutallab, a Nigerian banker and businessman, and his Yemeni origin second wife, Aisha. The father was described by the London Times in 2009 as being one of the richest men in Africa. He's a former chairman of the First Bank of Nigeria and former Nigerian Federal Commissioner for Economic Development. Abdul Mutallab was raised initially in an affluent neighborhood of Kaduna in Nigeria's north. He attended the elite Essence International School and also took classes at the Rabiatul Muttalib Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies, named for his grandfather. He then attended the British School of Lomé in Togo. He was considered a gifted student and athlete. For reasons that are unclear though, Abdul Muttalib became deeply religious as a teenager, even urging his father to give up his banking business, which he considered to violate Sharia law on the earning of interest. Following a year's language study in Sana'a, Yemen, his maternal home, Abdul Muttalib began to study at University College London in September 2005, where he gained degrees in engineering and business finance. In this time, he also became active in the student Islamist scene in London, participating in various protests supporting jihad against Western forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. This political activity likely cost Abdul Muttalib his student visa in 2009. Then he broke with his family and shifted to Yemen. Abdul Muttalib now traveled to the mountainous Shabwa province in Yemen and trained with al-Qaeda. Video of Abdul Muttalib and others training in a desert camp, firing weapons at targets including the Star of David and the British Union Jack flag, was produced by al-Qaeda and widely distributed. The tape includes a statement justifying Abdul Muttalib's actions against, I quote, the Jews and the Christians and their agents. Fearing for his son, Abdul Muttalib's father consulted with two Central Intelligence Agency officers at the US Embassy in Abuja, Nigeria, and warned them of his son's activities. The CIA, however, chose not to revoke Abdul Muttalib's American visa, fearing this might compromise another ongoing operation in Yemen. This enabled Abdul Muttalib to board a flight from Accra in Ghana to Detroit, traveling through Amsterdam. Like Richard Reed, Abdul Muttalib traveled with the bomb on his person, but this time instead of the shoes, it was sewn into his underwear. This underwear bomb ended with a bizarre showdown. Abdul Muttalib spent about 20 minutes in the toilet as the flight approached Detroit, then covered himself with a blanket after returning to his seat. Other passengers heard popping noises and smelled a foul odor. Some saw flames on Abdul Muttalib's trouser leg and on the wall of the plane. Jasper Schuringer, a Dutch film director, held Abdul Muttalib down while flight attendants extinguished the flames. This failure established that Richard Reed's chosen method was fated not to work. As I said, PETN is fairly stable and difficult to set alight, particularly because the most reliable detonators like blasting caps are metallic and can't be used because they would have been picked up even by screening methods in place before 9/11. Moreover, a successful explosion of Abdul Muttalib's underwear might well have failed to down the airliner. There were only 80 grams of PETN in Abdul Muttalib's underwear. Remember, Richard Reed had about 100. There's actually an interesting experiment which took place accidentally in Saudi Arabia, where a would-be al-Qaeda assassin inserted 100 grams of PETN in his anal cavity. The suicide bomber killed himself, but failed even to injure the intended victim who was standing very close by. Led by Rashid Rauf, a Pakistani-British dual national who was eventually killed in a drone strike, al-Qaeda now tried a third series of airline-related attacks, this time in 2006. A group of Britons of Pakistani origin were allegedly recruited to carry hydrogen peroxide onto transatlantic flights, mixed with the sugary orange drink Tang for concealment. The mixture would be injected into bottles of normal commercially available soft drinks with a syringe. Since the bottle's cap would not have been removed and the hole would have been resealed, the device would have resembled a normal unopened drink bottle when screened by airport security. The method of using liquid explosives with dissolved powder is similar to the composition used in the 21 July 2005 London bombings, which used hydrogen peroxide and chapati flour activated by a detonator. Rauf was believed to have been involved in that operation too and probably got the idea from what he'd done then. A second substance, a type of high explosive, would be hidden within a AA battery casing. This small explosive charge would then detonate the main bomb inside the soft drink bottle. The charge would be detonated by linking the bottle of explosives to a light bulb and a disposable camera. The charge from the camera's flash unit would trigger the explosion. The operation, however, was detected at an early stage when almost none of the plotters had even obtained passports or tickets. The plotters, moreover, had not conducted tests of their devices. Though officials claimed that the bombers had meant to target American Airlines, British Airways, Continental Airlines, and United Airlines flights to multiple destinations, only 3 men were eventually convicted of the charges. Rashid Rauf, a close associate of Jaish-e-Mohammed chief Maulana Masood Azhar, was held in Pakistan but acquitted of terrorism charges and eventually released. Failed terrorism plots rarely get attention. The scholar Brian Jenkins has noted that if all reported al-Qaeda plots had succeeded, 12 to 14 more commercial airliners would have been hijacked and perhaps crashed onto various targets. Another 15 would have been sabotaged or shot down with missiles. Several more ships would have been attacked, many additional bombings would have occurred, attacks involving lethal chemicals, botulinum, toxin, and ricin would have occurred in Europe and Jordan. And that's not counting a long list of shootings, stabbings, and beheadings. The point to note here is that most of these targets weren't defended by the additional security that went into place at airports, like taking away liquids and making people remove their shoes. They were deterred by good intelligence and good fieldcraft. The real solution wasn't ever more airport security, former CIA officer Bruce Hoffman has noted. He writes, and this is worth thinking about, the biggest mistake was to ignore al-Qaeda in Pakistan and instead to invade Iraq, which at that point posed no serious threat. The Bush administration underestimated Osama bin Laden's resilience, trusted the generals of Pakistan, and focused on the wrong battlefield. Hoffman's absolutely right, and there was a politics behind this. The effort wasn't to get the perpetrators, it was to reassure the public that it was safe by hiring more personnel and imposing restrictions on carry-on baggage. Now, this didn't necessarily make air travel more safe. In 2015, the TSA carried out an exercise where agents were asked to smuggle weapons past security checks. 95% of those agents succeeded in their task. Fake bombs and bomb components were also successfully smuggled past security in subsequent tests. Experts like the security technologist Bruce Schneier have argued that security responses to acts of terrorism are often theatrical, designed to reassure the frightened public rather than deal with the actual problem. The bans on wearing shoes and restrictions on the volume of liquids that could be carried were 2 such examples, he suggests. Instead, a program to spot potentially dangerous passengers similarly saw few arrests, 0.06% of travelers, and not one of those arrests was terrorism related. Larger investments in intelligence and more effective training and technology for defensive security measures are vital. We can't just turn around and say because a terror plot failed, we don't need to do anything at all to protect ourselves more effectively. But there are measures that cost less and are more effective than showy security systems. Auditing new methods and technologies for effectiveness is crucial too. So is the hard work of investing in police and intelligence work to deter and preempt plots. Richard Reed failed disastrously, and yet he succeeded in inflicting enormous costs. 23 years on, America's finally acknowledged it gave al-Qaeda a free win. This should probably make us ask some questions about India's own responses to catastrophic terrorist events. Did Mumbai really become safer because we bought large numbers of high-speed speedboats after 26/11 or special vehicles? Were buying fancy guns for policemen without time to train effectively in tactics and the use of those weapons really a good use of public money? I'll leave those questions hanging because I'm sure we'll return to them again. Thank you for watching this episode of The Print Explorer, and a special thanks to those of you who've been regularly following the program. I hope to see you all again next week.